Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Alon Ben-Meir. Today's guest is David L. Phillips, adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and academic visitor at St. Antony's College at Oxford University. He was previously director of the program on peacebuilding and rights at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. In this episode, Alon and David have an in-depth discussion on Syria, including Trump's removal of sanctions on the country, issues of governance in Syria, especially considering the country's numerous ethnic and religious minorities, and what can be expected of Ahmed al-Sharaa as an interim leader of Syria.
Hello, David. Hi. Very, very nice seeing you again. And I hope we're going to get together sometime soon again. I'm delighted, really delighted to have you today on this podcast, specifically talking about Syria. What's happening in that part of the world in the Middle East is extremely important, given the dramatic changes that have taken place in Syria and the continuing, obviously, turmoil throughout the region, in Lebanon, still in Israel, the Palestinians, etc. So I wanted to ask you to give us probably just an overview. What do you see happening now in Syria, specifically in the wake of Trump's decision to remove some of the sanctions, if not all the sanctions, and just an overall view, where do we go from here with the objective, of course, trying to achieve some kind of stability, hopefully peace in the end of the day?
Well, sanctions were imposed on Syria over the past 14 years in response to the Assad regime's treatment of its people. The recent regime change, bringing al-Sharaa to power, has changed the U.S. calculus, and the Trump administration has rushed to normalize relations with Syria. It wants Syria to join the Abraham Accords, and it wants the complete lifting of the Caesar sanctions so that Syria can reintegrate itself into the international economy. It's good that they're reaching out to al-Sharaa. It's good that Trump met with him in Riyadh, and also that he invited him to the White House. But lifting sanctions should be an incremental process, and it should be based on conditions and criteria. We don't want to rush to reintegrate Syria into the international community until it's proven that it's truly committed to ethnic and religious minority rights, particularly the rights of Kurds in the Northeast. So we're making progress in Syria, but al-Sharaa isn't out of the woods yet. He talks a good game, but we don't quite know what to believe about him.
So what would you want al-Sharaa to do, to suggest, to prove that he is very serious about this, because he suggested some prerogative? What are the things that we should expect him or want him to do to justify what the administration has decided to do in this regard? What is it you're looking at? What would you like to see happen?
Peace building in Syria requires a new governance arrangement. The problem with governance in Syria was always centralization of power in Damascus. It needs to diffuse power to the regions and make sure that ethnic and religious minorities are able to control their own affairs at the local level. If the Syrian democratic forces are going to reintegrate into the central government, that needs to be based on criteria. And those criteria require benchmarks. And without benchmarks, we can't measure al-Sharaa's progress. And we shouldn't fall all over ourselves in a rush to normalize relations with him.
Yeah. David, so I'd like to ask, suppose al-Sharaa ask you today, David, here my situation. I have at least 10 different, maybe more different ethnic groups in this country. Many of them at each other's throats still. What would you suggest I do in order to attain greater stability in Syria so that we can govern or begin to focus on economic development, good neighborly relations, potentially even peace with Israel, settling the problems in Lebanon? What sort of advice would you give him in that regard, given the untenable, the instability that they're still going through?
There needs to be a process for doing that. Syria needs to demonstrate goodwill towards the international community, and they can do that by holding elections at the earliest possible date, and then having an assembly that would be responsible for drafting a new constitution. The new constitution would decentralize powers on a federal model where maximum authority is allocated to the regions, so that incidents in Sueda and with the Druze aren't repeated, and providing incentives to the Kurds of Rojava, of northeast Syria, so that they can reintegrate into the central government, but based on benchmarks and performance.
Yeah, but let's say an election is held, and I'm sure you know that the likelihood that one segment of the group, which is the largest, which is the Sunni in Syria, may not win an outright majority to form a government. So we'll end up still having some kind of a coalition government. That is, what are some of the prerequisites these various factions need to know? There's going to be an election, one segment to like 5% or 10%, the other one 13%, the other one 4% of the vote. And in the end, if they're going to be through democracy, they're going to have to be forming some kind of a coalition government. What would you do given the horrific turmoil that's taken place since 2011, that to satisfy those smaller entities, smaller ethnic groups, smaller party, who may obviously will not garner majority, but they don't want to be obviously left out. So what do you suggest to Sharaa? Say, okay, you could potentially form a government with 2 or 3 other entities, but the others don't want to be left out. What kind of an arrangement? I mean, we've seen this historically happening in many places. It's a democracy, well, majority win, coalition, but those who remain in the opposition, are their needs, their requirement, their hope, their aspiration are not being met. And so in Syria in particular, this could continue to instigate a level of instability. Would there any kind of other formula, David, that you might want to suggest? I don't have one in mind, to be honest with you. I'd like to get your take on it.
I do have one in mind, and it's called asymmetrical federalism, where powers are divided between the federal units differently based on their culture, their history, their national aspirations. That's a good way of preserving territorial integrity while upholding the interests of minority groups and diffusing power from the center to the regions.
So you're talking about federalism then?
Talking about federalism, but asymmetrical federalism, where there are tailored arrangements for different communities. Some communities are going to want to have maximum local control. Other communities are going to be happily involved with the central government. So you need to have a formula that takes into account the range of different options. It's called asymmetrical because not all of the federal units are treated equally.
But this is asymmetrical. That is, in my view, this also could raise significant, serious question in terms of equitable distribution of resources, equitable distribution of political posts in the various areas. How do you satisfy that? That is, these groups, as it is asymmetrical, they will be participating in one form or another. But the nature of a human being, as you well know, we are all more greedy. We would like more power. We would like more influence. We would like to have a greater input, regardless of who we are, for that matter. From your experience, how do you satisfy these aspirations versus the reality that not everybody could have the same influence, the same power?
Have to accept that different communities have different aspirations, and they want a different slice of the pie for themselves. If there's enough power retained by the central government in the form of economy or resource management, they have an incentive to stay a part of the central government.
Yes, but then, sorry, go ahead.
If there's too much decentralization, then asymmetrical federalism is a pit stop on the path to fragmentation. So you need to come up with a balance there that works for everyone.
Okay, so let us go with this framework. In order to be able to do that, obviously you have to do some initial work. That is, in preparation for such an election and regard the potential outcome, there's going to have to be a process prior to undertaking any national election, so that everybody would know what to expect, regardless of what percentage I'm going to win at the end of the day of the popular vote. I know what I'm going to expect. Do you feel how necessary that must be in order, because otherwise people don't know what to expect. I garner only 10% of the vote. What sort of influence, what sort of power I'm going to have? What sort of political process, let's say, I would say even socio-political, economic process, but mostly political, need to be considered in advance to prepare the public for whatever outcome the election will produce, in order not to be surprised and to know what to expect and what role they'll be playing in such a future government. Could you try to describe that kind of process and how long would it take?
That process starts with a Bill of Rights, so that rights are assured for all. And then you can adjust the provision of special arrangements to each community, based on the asymmetrical federal model.
So let's talk a little bit about that. That is, establish a Bill of Rights. And let's say you're sitting again with Sharaa, and you're telling him, he will tell you, yes, David, it's absolutely right. Can you help me out in beginning to this process of trying to establish that kind of framework where human rights, Bill of Rights are going to be the governing process framework that we're going to be pursuing? How do you go about that, given the current reality in Syria?
You start by articulating basic freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. And then those are rights that exist for all citizens of a country like Syria. Then on top of it, you have this asymmetrical federalism with special arrangements that meet the needs of each community that are unique. In the case of Northeast Syria, for example, where 80% of the energy resources are based, you'd need to have special provisions that allow them to develop their energy resources and to benefit uniquely. But as long as there's a baseline of rights for all Syrians, then the country is less likely to fall apart, and Syrians are more likely to find common ground.
Yeah. They said, I want to focus on the three different groups. As you well know, of course, the Shia have been in power for 50 years, since half of Assad came to power. And so they are, in some ways, they're going to look back and say, we've been in power. And they're going to basically have to, and they are a minority, only 10-12% of the Syrian population. The Kurds in the north have their own aspiration, or at least autonomy. And they may very well, having their experience over so many decades now with the Turks, with Assad regime, they may be very suspicious of anyone who come and suggest, you're going to have equal rights, you don't have to worry about anything. Their experience, historically speaking, does not support that. And then you have the Sunnis, who have been a majority all along, that pretty much been sidelined with the half of the Assad, and then subsequently with Bashar Assad himself. There are many other groups. The Druze, and there's the Catholic, there's all kind of other religious and ethnic groups exist. But these are the three that are going to have to be satisfied in terms of what is when you talk about asymmetric type of federal entity. How do you, I had the opportunity to speak to many Kurds, spoke to, and they really don't believe that any government is going to satisfy their aspiration for at least autonomy, not to speak about independence. They know they cannot get independence, but they need complete and full autonomy. How does that fit? Let's start with them. Fit into your asymmetrical federal system.
There's going to be distrust between those three major groups, particularly given al-Sharaa's history as an Islamist and some of the things he said initially. One way to address that is to have not only decentralization arrangements built into the governance, into the Constitution, but to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission so that there's accountability for past crimes, activities that al-Sharaa may have been involved with in the past need to be exposed, and all Syrians need to be made aware that they're entering into a compact and drawing concessions designed to keep the country from falling apart. If there's enough decentralization and an adequate balance between the central government and the decentralized entities, then the country has a chance of hanging together. If there's too much decentralization, you're going to see fragmentation. Given the abuse that the Kurds have suffered, especially at the hands of Turkey, they have a legitimate reason to be concerned. You mentioned Turkey in your question. Now, Turkey is a wild card. They've been attacking the Kurds in northeast Syria. They've been bombing them. They've committed all kinds of terrible crimes. What's to guarantee that the Kurds won't repeat those crimes in the future? It's hard to imagine that al-Sharaa's government is going to stand up to Turkey and resist their encroachment. The U.S., as a guarantor of these arrangements, needs to exert its moral authority and its influence to make sure that there's not a repeat power grab by the Sunnis, motivated by Turkey and its hidden agenda.
You see, as it's happening now, I've been writing a major piece on Turkey. And one of the points, of course, I came across that his relation with Erdogan has all these years and been absolutely committed to prevent the Syrian Kurds from attaining any kind of autonomy in Syria itself, fearing, of course, that that is going to have a ripple effect for the Kurds in Turkey itself, and of course, along the line of what the Kurds in Iraq have, which is a pretty much autonomous role, but is that with an agreement with the central government in Baghdad, in Iraq. But with Syria, now he feels that he has come up, that he has absorbed so many refugees to the tune of 3.5, 4 million Syrian refugees, that he's been so helpful throughout the years, and he's been maintaining such good relationship with al-Sharaa. So what we are saying here, he, knowing how he functioned, have had direct dealings with the Turkish government in the past many years, for many years. I know what he is going to say to Sharaa. We are not going to allow the Kurds under any circumstances to have any kind of autonomy. Now, my question to you, David, do you feel that the Kurds would agree to what you are talking about, asymmetrical federal system, whether they're part of the whole process, rather than agreeing, because we have the history of suspicions, of concern, of not trusting anyone? How could we could overcome that? Do you think that Sharaa is going to try to reconcile what Erdogan would like to see happen versus what the Kurds may very well insist on happening?
I don't think that al-Sharaa is conciliatory at his core. Moreover, he's controlled by Erdogan, who is his sponsor and provides weapons and money to the government in Damascus. So Turkey is going to definitely try to meddle in Syria's internal affairs. So far, the Kurds have shown that they have the capacity to resist that kind of meddling because they have a very capable fighting force and they have shown an ability to resist outside influence. Whether that changes in the future, we need to stay vigilant and monitor the situation. But I think the Kurds have to negotiate at this stage in the political transition what it wants in Syria, make clear what decentralization requirements they have, and then use that as the basis for talks going forward. The U.S. also has a role to play. U.S. Central Command is close by. If the U.S. wants to support Kurdish interests, it is in a position to do so. I don't have a lot of confidence that Donald Trump is going to want to uphold Kurdish interests, but if the U.S. feels it's in its interest to do so, we may see a more equitable approach.
Yeah, but you raised a good couple of points that very important to dwell on it a little bit, and that is the Kurds obviously are very suspicious and they don't trust the Turks as far as they can throw them. That's not going to happen. They also understand the influence of Erdogan over al-Sharaa. Sharaa understands that he cannot do much without getting continuing complete support of Turkey as well, because for him this is a prerequisite. Again, refugees, economy, relationship, neighborly relation, all of that. So there is here inherent, built-in inconsistency, contradiction. That is the Kurds, Turkey, and the Sharaa. And so that is, as I see it, this is going to be a problem. It has, in fact, it started already to simmer. Just mind you, I'm going to remind you of this one. I'm sure you know the effort from Oslo only a few months ago said that we lay down our arms. We are ready to sit down. We no longer seeking a state of our own. We just want to have autonomous rule of so. And the symbolic movement on the part of the Turks and the PKK, some of them, burn their weapons to demonstrate that they are sincere about it. But then Erdogan, thus far, as of today, has done absolutely nothing, not a single concession. And the negotiations basically are not taking place, even though al-Sharaa and his followers and everybody say, all we want is to have our right as an ethnic group to be respected. We're not looking for a statehood. We're looking to be part and parcel of Turkey. But we want to speak our language, we want to have our own school, we want to have our culture, or sing, or dance. That's what we want. So now these negotiations are frozen. Now take that back into Syria. And that is where I find it extremely troubling, very difficult. How do we try to, and that's going to be a contentious issue for many, many years to come. But David, from your perspective, what force can we bring in to try to change these dynamics, if any?
Well, typically the U.S. would be a force of moderation, but under the Trump administration, we've shown that the Kurds can be thrown under the bus in a moment. And that could happen in this instance as well. So there needs to be international organization in support of Kurdish rights. And the Kurds themselves have to be very clear at the outset what is their bottom line.
Define international organization. What does that mean? What are the composition we're talking about? And what sort of authority will they have?
So I think the EU plays a major role here. Turkey's application to join the EU has been suspended on human rights grounds. The EU needs to make clear under what conditions they would reopen negotiations with Turkey. The UN has a role to play as well. But we can't take anything for granted. The Kurds themselves have to champion their own interests. And that means making clear what their demands are and what they're willing to accept.
Yeah. I don't want to deviate much if I want to stay with Syria and Turkey and the Kurds. But I can tell you from my understanding from leading members of the EU leadership, the notion that Turkey will ever become an EU member state is practically doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. And we don't need to go into that. It's a large population, larger, equivalent to Germany. They will be seeking chairmanship of so many important committees within the EU. and for the EU to have a Muslim state with an automatic ambition to become a member of the EU, for them, basically it's non-starter. So honestly, from my perspective, the EU involvement, I agree with you, is necessary. But the conducement cannot be membership in the EU. It doesn't exist. And I'm not sure even that Erdogan himself wants to. And look what he's doing as a member of NATO. He's a wild card, even within NATO itself. So the relationship between the EU, is one of necessity, one of needs. Turkey being a hub for energy, Turkey being East and West bridge, Turkey being have refugees. They don't want to unleash them against Europe. So they have a reason to cooperate with Erdogan. Do they like him? Do they want him? I think they would like to throw him as far as they can get. They can do that. So I don't want to too much deviate in that direction. But let's go just back there, because what you are suggesting, I like. I mean, I think what you are saying is absolutely valid. That is, Sharaa is going to have to sit down with his advisor and say, look, here we have 12 years of horrific war in Syria, hundreds of thousands, I don't know. Do you know the numbers of people who died other than being refugees? 500,000, maybe more. David, I'm not sure of the number. The destruction is so people are not going to forget this anytime. So you're going to have to sit down, ask for, do you agree with this? Ask for the leadership of the various ethnic groups and say, let's sit down and have a conversation about where do we go from here. Would you have that kind of start?
You need to have a dialogue between the ethnic groups so they can come up with a unified position and make demands of al-Sharaa. Unless they have a common approach, it'll be easy to pick them off and divide them. So the Christians, the Alawites, the Druze, the Kurds, all need to get together. And that process is underway. There are meetings occurring between the ethnic and religious minorities. There isn't a unified platform yet. I'll be involved in a meeting in London next month, where many of these groups are going to get together, and we're going to talk about rebuilding Syria. Rebuilding Syria is not bricks and mortar. It's about governance, and it's about relationships between the different communities. It's a complicated and challenging endeavor, but if there's dialogue between those directly affected, I have some hope they'll have success.
Well, what's your take of where Sharaa stands as far as that's concerned? What do you see is missing yet, is not able to still grasp what it's going to take? Because you have reservation, rightfully so, about where Sharaa stands altogether. And does he really have a comprehensive grasp? What is going to take? On what path to put Syria to restore stability, to restore it as a viable country in the Middle East, given its location, its importance to both enemies and its friends. So what's your take on Sharaa himself, David?
It's going to require carrots and sticks. Carrots in the form of incentives and rewards, primarily in finance and security matters, but also sticks, withholding progress from Syria if they backslide and return to the abuse of minority rights, as we've seen in the Northwest recently and in the Druze area.
So I mean, do you see him adopting the kind of reform, the kind of peace process, quote unquote, to pursue that with a specific goal in mind? I mean, do you feel that he has a specific goal in mind, what that goal is, and what it consists of?
So he wants to have it both ways. He wants to be fully reintegrated into the international system without making too many concessions. It's important that Western countries and also some in the Middle East and the Gulf get together and have a unified approach, have a unified platform, what they're prepared to give, what they expect, and that they communicate that clearly to al-Sharaa. Having a U.S. envoy there is a good step in that direction, but the U.S. still doesn't have a diplomatic facility in Damascus. It's going to have to consider the timing and process for normalizing those diplomatic relations and making an impression on Sharaa, what he's going to get and what we expect.
Well, then this is the point that I would like to dwell on for a couple of minutes. And you spoke about Trump. Do you feel that Trump has any kind of, any of his advisors for that matter, of knowing who he surrounds himself with? Any idea, okay, what does he want to, I mean, I was surprised, to tell the truth, when he met with Sharaa in Riyadh. I was surprised to hear that he was proceeding now with normalization of relations, so these people are not there yet. Does he have a strategy that you are aware of? This is what we want to do in Syria. And another thing, whatever it's going to take, Syria is going to require a massive amount of money injection in order to put Syria back on its feet. Do you have any, because I've been trying to find out how far this Trump, knowing who he is, I mean, this guy says something today and then changes his mind the next day. Does he really have any specific agenda, specific plan of action, other than show and tell? Let's send a representative of the United States there. What do you see? Do you see any more than that? I mean, I don't. I really don't. I don't trust anything Trump does at this point.
For the record, I don't either, but he does have a capable advisor in the form of Tom Barak, and Barak has his ear. If he wants to make clear the criteria for normalization and the process and the pace of normalization, he has the ability to institutionalize that as U.S. policy. But left to his own devices, Trump would just give away the store. He's so interested in his role as a peacemaker that he would acquiesce to any of Syria's demands if it advanced his goals of international recognition in a peace process. So we have to be very wary. Trump is not going to do the right thing because of his instincts. He may do the right thing because he's well advised and because he feels it's in America's interest.
And so, which means if I were Sharaa and I assess who Trump is, and Sharaa obviously is no dummy, he's a smart fellow. And I would say to myself, I cannot rely on this guy. This guy wants to get the Nobel Peace Prize next year. He's going to claim he made peace, like exactly what you said. And will he, in fact, deliver when it comes to the billions and billions of dollars necessary? Of course, along with other countries, specifically from the Gulf state. So if I were Sharaa, of course, you need the United States. So happy it's led by this fool, but you need the United States. But to what extent actually that is going to materialize? I mean, this got to be in the aid of Sharaa today. So just let's take it from there. What role should the Gulf states, led specifically by Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi in particular, they have a say in terms of national security, geostrategic interests. They have a say what Syria is going to be in the future. It's going to impact them in one form or another. What role do you think they should play? And given that there's no uncertainty whatsoever what Trump is going to do.
So their role is still undetermined. The U.S. can guide that process, but in order to guide that process, the U.S. has to be engaged. And the U.S. has been disengaged from Syria for some years. So we have to make a strategic decision that we want to lean forward, that we want to use our influence, work through Gulf and regional allies to try to influence al-Sharaa's behavior. The U.S. doesn't have a lot in the toolbox. CENTCOM does because of the security assistance. But we need to make a clear statement to al-Sharaa what we want from him and let him know that there's a cost if he doesn't play ball. The U.S. has the ability to do that. Whether it has the good judgment or the moral authority is still to be determined. But Syria is at a critical moment, and the whole Middle East is at a critical moment. If we exert influence in the right direction, the Syrian people would be well served.
Yeah, but then, Trump is transactional. I mean, for him, it's anything he does kind of treat it like another real estate transaction with Syria. I think Sharaa understand that. But I want to ask you the question then. But suppose Trump does not follow through, and probably he won't, but they're not going to follow through. Other than playing the tune of Trump, Sharaa would want to keep that relationship going, regardless of the ultimate outcome may or may not come out of it. What would you do if you were Sharaa with the inability to rely on the United States, and now you have all the chess in front of you, all these various players? Are you going to have to still to put them together? And so there is those inherent contradiction, inconsistencies built into the entire thing. I mean, it's so extraordinarily complex, as you well articulated that. So do you see, toward the end of this conversation that you are taking, do you really see a credible process? I mean, if you could describe in a few words, a credible process, I cannot rely on Trump. I'm not sure to what extent Sharaa is going to be able to use the asset he has or the lack of asset that he has. Can we create now a scenario, David? It's incredible, doable. Say, if this can happen, and we should pursue it in this way. If you can reiterate some of these things that you have indicated before.
There needs to be a clearly articulated platform of religious and minority rights.
By whom?
By al-Sharaa, but
Okay.
influenced by the US and other countries. We need to tell al-Sharaa what we expect from him, and we need to have a scorecard so that these spasms of violence that we saw in the spring and summer don't continue. If al-Sharaa continues to attack religious and ethnic minorities, if he decides to turn on the Kurds in the Northeast, then that's going to be a poison pill. Al-Sharaa is not going to be able to normalize its relations with the West and the international community. So we need to hold his feet to the fire. Al-Sharaa, though, has proven to be a shrewd politician. He will placate Trump. He'll tell Trump what he wants to hear. He might even nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize if there's some dividend for Syria. So we really don't know what is going to happen in the foreseeable future. Israel is also a wild card. Israel has a direct interest in the outcome in Syria. What can we expect from Israeli leaders? And to what extent will the US participate in Israel's agenda? It remains to be seen. But definitely Israel, the United States, and European countries have a voice here. And we just have to make sure that the voice is constructive and that relations are positive.
And you think, Sharaa, he is, and he has all of these entities to deal with. He has Israel, he has the United States, he has Turkey, he has the EU to some extent, of course, and he has a dozen ethnic groups that he has to create some kind of process of reconciliation between all of them. Many of these mentioned, that do not necessarily have the same objective. Israel has a different kind of objective to maintain its security at all costs. It doesn't want to return any territory. It doesn't a major point of contention between the two countries for the foreseeable future. As long as the Netanyahu government is in power, who knows what's going to happen after the election next year. I say there's all these unknown quantities that we really don't know how that's going to find out in the end. I always, I always commit myself to finding a solution, complex resolution. I'll be honest with you, I've been struggling with that when it comes to Syria, and it's not easy. It's extremely tough because we didn't even touch on Lebanon. That's another player in the mix. what's going to happen with Lebanon, given the proximity, given the turmoil in Lebanon, given what Hezbollah is going to do. And then we have another component we never mentioned by any of it, Iran. Has Iran really given up, surrendered, forgot all of it? Or the report I have now, they are doing everything humanly possible to try to strengthen Hezbollah again. Hezbollah still refusing to disarm. So you have that's another layer that al-Sharaa will have to deal with. And if I were his advisor, I said, God help me.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Final comment on your part, David.
I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed this conversation. Syria is an important country. It's geographically located in a pivotal place. And I'm hoping that the Syrian people, after suffering abuse for so many years, are going to be able to take their country back and establish accountable and representative government. For that to really work, the Kurds need to play a critical role. So let's see what kinds of decentralization arrangements exist for the Kurds. I think that will be the litmus test of what direction Syria is going.
Terrific. Well, David, as always, this should not be the last podcast we're going to have on Syria. We're going to have another one.
Happy to do it.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you as always.
Okay. Thanks, Alon. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.